Good afternoon. I'm Michael Bryant, and I serve at Charleston Southern University and the Whitfield Center for Christian Leadership. We're privileged today to have Dr. Carl Trueman from Grove City College in Pennsylvania, and we're excited to be with you today. Dr. Trueman, welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to join you.
Yeah, you are joined today by CSU students, faculty, and staff, and we also have some outside guests, and they're thrilled to talk to you about your new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and a Road to Sexual Revolution. Our format today is just to turn it over to Dr. Trueman, and he is going to walk us through telling us why he wrote the book, maybe some major points in the book, and then we especially wanted to know the relevance for the church and maybe what the church should be doing now in light of our current cultural context. And so the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be with you. I wish I was in the Carolinas in person today. It's about 28 degrees, and I think it's dropping to -4 or something in the next week here. So it's a rough place to be in the middle of winter, Western Pennsylvania, but very beautiful in the summer. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks very much for the interest you've shown in the book and for the opportunity to speak about it. For those of you who don't know me, which is probably all or most of you, I'm Carl Trueman. I have a degree in classics from the University of Cambridge. And then I went from Cambridge to the University of Aberdeen, where I'd studied Reformation thought in the Faculty of Divinity there. I taught at the universities of Nottingham and Aberdeen in the United Kingdom and came to the US in 2001. I did serve for 6 months as a visiting fellow at Calvin College in the mid-90s. Came here as a permanent resident, ultimately, in 2001. And I taught at Westminster Theological Seminary, a Presbyterian seminary in Philadelphia for 16 years. Then I did a year as a visiting fellow at Princeton University, which is where I did the bulk of the research and work on the book that I'm going to speak about today. And while I was there, I had the great fortune to be offered a job at Grove City College in beautiful but not always warm Western Pennsylvania. So that's how I got to where I am today. And that brings me to the book, because from what I've just, I should also add, I was a pastor part-time, which is effectively full-time when there is no other pastor for 6 of my years at Westminster. I'm an ordained minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So I pastored for 6 years, which raised a number of the questions that actually lie behind the book that I want to talk about today. My book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, clearly from the very brief autobiography I've just given, it should be evident that the book is a break from my typical academic specialization, which is Reformation history, Reformation thought. That's where my training is. Though I've always taken the view that if you're trained as a historian, and I've been studying / teaching history now for 35 years, if you're trained as a historian, then you always think historically, and you can look at almost any subject on the face of the earth and have a historian's perspective on it. So that's the sort of the academic background to approaching this book. Why this book in particular? Why did I choose to write on the rise and triumph of the modern self? Number of reasons. Some of them purely personal. In my late 40s, I felt that I'd probably written everything I needed to write on the Reformation, and was simply getting a bit bored and looking for something else, something more interesting, more challenging to do. Fortunate to be at a point in my career when I was able to do that. Secondly, I was approached more or less simultaneously by Rod Dreher, the senior editor at the American Conservative magazine, and Justin Taylor, the senior editor at Crossway, asking if I would be interested in writing an introduction to the thought of Philip Rieff, the psychological sociologist who taught at the University of Pennsylvania for many years. So I started to work on that. And as I was working on that, it became evident to me that a more interesting book would actually be to take some of Rieff's ideas and apply them to our contemporary situation. The third thing that drove the book was partly my experience as a pastor, partly my experience as a parent, partly my experience as a teacher. partly my experience as a Christian witnessing what is going on in the world today. And I was struck by the dramatic changes that were taking place in the sexual mores of society, the sexual values of society, and also by the dramatic changes that were taking place in the notions of human identity. Obergefell v. Hodges, the great Supreme Court case deciding gay marriage, came down in 2015. But almost as soon as that decision came down, transgender ideology carried all before it. And one of the things that struck me as a pastor was many people in my congregation were deeply disturbed by what was going on. They didn't understand how everything they thought was solid and secure seemed to be dissolving into the air around them. And I thought it would be interesting to explore that issue, because very few things in history happen very rapidly unless they're grounded in much, much deeper historical trends and transformations. So that was one of the things that intrigued me. And that crystallized around the meaning and coherence of a particular sentence. And the sentence is this: I am a woman trapped in a man's body. Now, set aside whether we think that's a good statement or a bad statement or whatever, let's just take it as a statement. What intrigues me about that statement is that if I said that to my grandfather, who died, just 30 years ago, my grandfather would have probably laughed out loud. He wouldn't have had the categories to grasp what's being said there. And yet today, the average man or woman in the street would not regard that as a particularly exceptional sentence. It's become something that kind of makes sense to us. And the question for me was, well, what issues, what has to become part of the way people think, the way people intuitively think in society, for that sentence to make sense, not just to gender theorists in university seminar rooms, but to ordinary people, my neighbors, my friends, people who've never studied philosophical theory, critical theory in any great depth. What has to have happened in the culture for them to find a statement like that to be something that makes a kind of intuitive sense? And that was the sort of the driver of the book. Now, I was aware as I headed into writing a book like this, as soon as you're starting to touch on issues of identity, particularly sexual identity, you're heading into territory where passions run very deep, and you can end up upsetting people, offending people, getting into trouble very, very quickly. And so at the back of my mind was also the what I would call maybe a methodological concern, or a concern about the way I wanted to write the book. I wanted to write a book which I would feel no embarrassment about handing to a gay friend, for example, or a transgender person. I wanted to write in a way that when we come to the final chapter and I talk about the church's response to this, they may well turn around to me and say, well, we disagree with your last chapter. But actually, the narrative you tell, you've done it fairly. You have described the changes that have gone on. You have not adopted a kind of position where you have made judgments on those changes. I teach young people between the ages of 18 and 22 in a liberal arts college, many of them Christians, some of them aren't. None of them, I think, respond particularly well to red in tooth and claw polemics. They want to be persuaded. They want calm and dispassionate discussion. If they are not personally touched by the kinds of issues I'm writing about, they have friends who are. And so the final sort of piece in the jigsaw puzzle to me was, there's a lot of stuff being written in the Christian and the non-Christian world on these topics, and much of it is highly charged and emotional. I wanted to take a step back and say, okay, I may have strong opinions on this stuff, but I'm not going to allow it to distort the story I tell. What I want to do is tell a fair and dispassionate story about what I think has happened in our culture. And each of the thinkers I engage with, I try, as I do in the classroom, I always have this thought in my mind, if Karl Marx was sitting on my shoulder, he's a big guy actually, but if he was looking over my shoulder, if Karl Marx was looking over my shoulder as I describe his thoughts, at the end of the class, he might say to me, well, I disagree with your conclusions about my work, but you presented me fairly. You did understand what I was trying to say. And that's what I tried to do in this book, dealing with issues of sexual identity. Say, why is it these things have become plausible? Not are they right or wrong, but what's changed in our society to frame the question for us? So that was the sort of the guiding, driving principles behind the book. How did I structure the book? Well, first of all, this is a huge story. The story of how these things come about is huge, and it's impossible to cover it in a single book. Even a book of 400 pages, longest book I've ever written, even a book of 400 pages ultimately has to be very, very selective. So very careful to say at the start of the book, what I'm telling is a partial story. I'm telling the story of the men and the women who philosophized those things that are now our intuitions. Many of the things that we instinctively believe, I'm looking at the men and women who actually consciously thought them out. How their high-flying philosophical thoughts become the intuitions of society, that story is much broader than the one I tell. It involves discussion of technology, popular culture, all kinds of things have to come into that story. I'm just telling the very, very narrow story of how the intellectual elites formulated this stuff. So that's the first thing. Second thing, go back to that statement. I am a woman trapped in a man's body. If you think about that statement, let's forget my granddad for a moment, but let's think about somebody in the medical profession. Let's say 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, somebody goes to their doctor and they sit in their doctor's surgery, in the doctor's consulting room, and they say to the doctor, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. The doctor in 1960 or 1970 is going to respond, okay, you've got a problem, and the problem is with your mind. What we need to do is bring your mind into sort of uniformity with your body. Now, imagine that same scenario played out today, 2021. Somebody goes to their doctor, sits in the consulting room and says, doctor, I've got a problem. I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. The doctor's response is going to be, you have a problem with your body, and we now need to work on bringing your body into conformity with your mind. When you compare those two things, what's happened in society between those two events? I would say it's this. Inner feelings, inner convictions have been given an authority in shaping or determining our identity, which trumps, which stands over, which defeats, if you like, the physical constitution of our body. In other words, the story that I wanted to tell, I realized fairly early on, is the story of that. How is it that we have reached a point in contemporary culture where our feelings are decisive for our identity? Human beings have always had feelings. We've always had that inner space. If you read the Psalms, they're full of emotions. You look at a Greek tragedy or read Homer's Iliad or Homer's Odyssey. One of the things that makes Homer's Iliad such a striking poem is we can identify with some of the emotions laid out there. We've always had that inner life. So it's not that human beings have suddenly developed an inner life in the last 20, 30, 40 years. It's always been there. What's different is that we suddenly or have started to give that inner life such tremendous importance that pretty much everything else has to fall into line behind it. And it was that idea that kind of gripped my imagination as I was starting to work on this, thinking, how on earth do I tell a story that makes kind of sense? Well, I have to establish the central plot line. And the central plot line for me is this: the rise in authority of human emotions, that inner life over everything else. And that, in order to sort of start my story, every historian has to start somewhere. And, if you ever write history, if you ever do a history paper, you'll know that wherever you start, the easiest criticism of your paper is going to be, why didn't you start 10 years before that point you chose? There's always a backstory to any beginning point in history. I chose to start with a man called Rousseau, great Genevan philosopher of the 18th century. And I chose to start with Rousseau, not because he was the first man who placed great emphasis on the inner life, but because his thinking crystallizes the authority of the inner life in a rather remarkable way. He writes an autobiography called Confessions, which is the story of his life. One of the things he says in this autobiography is this: in order to tell you the story of my life, I am going to focus on my feelings. The story of my life, we might say, is the story of my inner life. It's my thinking, it's my motivation, it's my desires, it's my pleasures, it's my pains. To know me, you need to know those things. And this connects to a broader philosophy for Rousseau, a philosophy whereby he says, you know, the real you is who you are when society isn't squeezing you into its mold. The real you is that voice of nature inside that society will try and twist and push into different shapes and make conform to its outward conventions. But all of that makes you less you. So if you want to know who the real you is, Rousseau says, try to get back to that inner voice of nature. Now, when you think about that actually correlates quite closely with some of the things we now see in society around us. Perhaps the most famous example of a trans person in America, possibly the West today, is Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner. And as he was then, Bruce Jenner was interviewed by Diane Sawyer in around about 2015. You can find the interview online. What's interesting is the language that Jenner uses in that. Uses language such as, you know, I've been living a lie and now I can be the real me. All these years I've been performing the role that society placed upon me. Now I'm liberated to be the real person that I always was inside. That psychologizing of the person that we see in Rousseau, that emphasis upon inner feelings as being the real you, and society squeezing those inner feelings and making you pretend to have feelings you don't have, or pretend to be something that you aren't inside, that really is very much at the heart of what it means to be a modern person today. And again, when you think, you read sometimes in the news of a gay person who perhaps has left their wife and run off with another man. And again, the language is often interesting, that I've been living a lie. And finally, I'm able to be authentic. I can be the real me. That witnesses to that authority that's granted to the inner space. And this idea of Rousseau is picked up by the Romantics, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Bysshe Shelley. These are the guys who sort of really pick up on this, say, yeah, you know, it's those inner feelings, they really determine who you are. And we got to use our poetry, not to tell stories of heroes of ancient Greece, et cetera, we got to use our poetry to talk about nature, to talk about ordinary people. Wordsworth writes a poem with a very now politically incorrect title, The Idiot Boy, which is a story about a boy, we would now say, who has, you know, educational special needs. He's a very simple child. And Wordsworth gets criticized for this by a friend, John Wilson, who says it's distasteful to write about a child with learning difficulties. And Wordsworth says no, because the child with learning difficulties like that, we would say today, he has no filters. What you see is what you get. What he feels inside is what he says. That's an authentic person. That represents authentic human nature. So the first part of my story is really the story of, well, how is it that we start to think that our inner feelings are most important for who we are? Second part of the story then, of course, comes, well, you know, one of the interesting things about the present day is how sex dominates everything. We don't just think of ourselves as having an inner space and that being decisive for our identity. We typically think about that inner space as being most profoundly shaped by sexual desires. Again, when you think of the language of lesbian, gay, bi, these are interesting terms, because what those terms tell me is that those who use those terms, and even if you call yourself straight, if you say, well, I'm a straight person, that tells me that you're allowing your sexual desires to be really determinative of who you are. If you go back to ancient Greece, I did classics in undergraduate. You go back to ancient Greece, lots of homosexuality in ancient Greece. You know, homosexuality was not invented by Oscar Wilde. It's there in ancient Greece. What's interesting in ancient Greece, though, is that nobody thinks of themselves as gay. They're people who engage in homosexual activity, but they don't see that sexual desire as being determinative of who they are. Sex, if you like, is an activity to them. So how do we get from this inner space that Rousseau and the Romantics have developed to seeing this inner space as really profoundly and decisively sexual? Well, here the key figure in the story, I think, is Sigmund Freud. There are others in Freud's circle, but Sigmund Freud is the man who essentially says, the Romantics have got this right. The inner self is there. That's important for who you are. But what they get wrong is this. The Romantics have this rather optimistic view of this inner self, that it's all empathetic and nice, etc. Freud says, no, actually, from the moment we're born, possibly even before we leave the womb, what really drives human beings is sexual desire. That's what really shapes human beings, is sexual desire. In one single move there, Freud moves sex from being an activity to being an identity. Yes, we have this inner space, but this inner space is sexual. And so human identity becomes not simply psychological, but psychological and sexual as well. You're right, your desires are fundamentally determinative of who you are for Freud. And Freud's ideas, though many of his theories have been debunked, I think one, he's on to something, because for most human beings, our sexual desires are some of the most powerful desires we feel, and they shape some of the most profound relationships we have. And two, it's a very attractive idea for human beings as well. I have to say to the students here, nobody ever loses money in the history of ideas by saying people should have more sex rather than less. That's a winning formula by and large. So Freud is the man who takes that inner space and makes it sexual. The next move, of course, is, okay, so, but how does all this get political? We live in a world now where, the two big issues in the public square today, I think, are this. They're issues of race and issues of sexuality. They are related. I can't go into the race one today, but to think about the sexuality one, how is it that sex has become so political? Well, the answer really, at one level, the answer I give in the book is it involves the sort of the thinking or the adoption of Freudian ideas by a group of left-wing thinkers, Marxists in the mid-20th century. But we don't have to go there in order to make sense of this. If I were to say to you, your sexual desires are the most fundamental part of you, your identity is at ground level a sexual identity, that's who you are, then inevitably, sex is politicized, because rules about sexual behavior are rules about who you are as a person. When you think about that relative to LGBTQ rights, if, for example, homosexual male sex is illegal, that's not just an activity being made illegal. That's an identity being outlawed. If you say that gay couples can't get married, it's not simply an activity that's being banned in the mind of the gay person. It's an identity being scorned. It's why cake baking, on one level, cake baking, it's hard to, I love cakes, they're delicious. But in some ways, it's hard to imagine. It would have been hard to imagine 20, 25 years ago that some of the most contentious legal cases of our time have focused on cake baking. And why is that the case? Well, it's a collision of two worlds there. When the Christian cake baker is asked to bake a cake for a gay wedding, he's being asked, in his mind, to approve the gay wedding. And he doesn't think he should be required to approve of something he disapproves. So he refuses to make the cake. In the gay couple's mind, of course, what the Christian cake baker is doing is denying the legitimacy of their identity. He's pushing them to the margins. He's refusing to recognize them for who they are. So the politicization of all this is sort of inevitable. Once something becomes ground zero for your identity, it's inevitably going to be political. And this is one of the reasons why this is such a tricky situation for the church now, because the Christian church has specific views about sexual behavior. What the world hears, of course, is the Christian church having specific views about who is and who is not a legitimate and real person. When I was a young guy, I remember at college talking to gay friends, etc. And one of the things I would say at times was, I hate the sin, but I love the sinner. In other words, I hate homosexual activity, but I love you as a friend. That only makes sense to somebody who's able to make the distinction between the sin and the sinner. If homosexual sex is a component part of your identity, then you can't accept that distinction. And therefore, that statement makes no sense anymore. So the story I wanted to tell, as I said, was the psychologizing of the self, whereby my feelings become determinative, the sexualizing of that psychology, and then the politicizing of that psychology through the politicizing of sex. Just reflect on how that might affect us in the world today before I offer some thoughts on the church. It sort of turns everything upside down in a way. Once identity is psychological, then some of the most damaging things you can do to a person are use bad words about them. Thomas Jefferson. I'm, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from the south side of Philly. I'm from far east in the United Kingdom. So I'm not a huge fan of the American War of Independence, or the illegal colonial rebellion, as we like to call it back home. But Thomas Jefferson, who is one of the great founders of America, has that really fascinating statement when he's talking about freedom of religion. And he says, what does it matter to me if my neighbor believes in one God, 20 gods, or no God at all? It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And Jefferson there is really talking as a man for whom identity is very much wrapped up in bodily health and the ownership of property. That's what made somebody in Jefferson's America. It's a very economic kind of way of thinking of personhood. We now have a very psychological way of thinking about personhood. That changes everything. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We probably all heard that in the playground, and we all know it's complete nonsense. I played rugby at school when I was a kid. I got hurt a lot, I'm sure. I don't remember any of the bashes I took on the rugby. I got a little scar over my eye, that's a little reminder, but I don't remember any of the physical bashes. I can still remember cruel things that were said to me. And I can still remember cruel things I said to other people that I still blush about nearly 50 years on. Words are powerful. And in a world where identities are constructed psychologically, words can be weapons. Freedom of speech and freedom of religion. This is where it starts to sort of really pinch for the church at this point. Freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Jefferson regarded them as social virtues because they sort of guaranteed the kind of freedoms required for a world where property and bodily safety were the center of how one thought about oneself. In a world where we think of ourselves in psychological terms, if the story I tell is true, then words become exceptionally dangerous, and freedom of speech and freedom of religion cease to look like virtues and start to look like a problem. If I can say whatever I want in the public square, that's a license for me to use whatever words I want about anybody. And where people think of themselves psychologically, when I use words that deny their psychological identity, marginalize their psychological identity, then they think I'm doing real harm to them. So one of the sort of the immediate practical outworkings of my narrative is this. We're going to see pressure on freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I wrote the book in 2018. I did not anticipate the developments of 2020 at that point. I couldn't have asked in some ways for a better year for the book to be published in. It's been such total chaos. Look at the battles over language that have erupted in our culture this last year. Understandable against the background of a change in how we understand ourselves. When my feelings are what constitute the real me, then anything that hurts those feelings damages the real me. And that's why freedom of speech and freedom of religion are becoming problematic for many people in society. How might the church respond to this? The graveyard is full of academics who have predicted the future and got it horribly wrong. So by and large, I try to avoid that. But I think there are a number of things that the church needs to take into account as we think about the future. First of all, realize that the framework has changed. The framework of Jefferson's world, for example, that's not the framework of our world. We need to understand that religion now faces challenges because it's seen not simply as an intellectual problem, but as a moral problem. If you object to gay marriage, or if you object to trans thinking, that is seen by wider society as a moral problem because it's damaging the psyche and the psychology of certain people. And the church needs to be aware of that, not for the church necessarily to change its position, but for the church to realize why it's going to get a very vehement reaction to previously traditionally unexceptionable positions. Secondly, I think the church needs to think very carefully about how we teach our people, particularly young people. One of the things I've noticed at Grove is I've got a lot of Christians in class. They're not all Christians, but many of them are. And if I say to them, doing X is wrong because the Bible says so, that's good enough for most of them to an extent. But sometimes it gets the question coming back in return, but why does the Bible say that? Does the Bible say that such and such a pattern of behavior is wrong simply because God doesn't want people to be happy? In that situation, I think the church needs to be able to offer, I won't say better, what better rationale can there be than the Bible for something? But I think it is helpful to the church as we teach people, particularly young people, people in general. It's helpful for the church to support positions, biblical positions, with arguments that show that the biblical position makes sense on other grounds as well. And in the book, I propose a couple of things. I think a theology of the body. A theology of the body is very, very helpful. What do I mean by that? Well, at its simplest, I mean, the body is designed in certain ways to perform certain functions. I said to the students in my classes, I'm not going to go up on top of the Empire State Building and jump off because I'm going to plunge to my death. I'm not a bird. I wish that I was a peregrine falcon, fastest creature on the face of the planet, one of the most graceful creatures on the face of the planet. My body is not designed that way. There is an intrinsic design to my body. I would say sexually, there's an intrinsic design to my body that means that it complements the female body in a way that sexual union is supposed to occur in some ways and not in others. So a theology of the body, I think, is important, and understanding that actually our physical makeup carries with it a significance for what human flourishing is, what human flourishing should look like. Natural law is connected to the theology of the body as well. The idea that actually there is in nature a structure that means if we do some things, we will flourish, and if we do other things, we will not flourish. Natural law has generally not been highly thought of by Protestants for some good reasons and some bad reasons. It needs to be qualified and thought about carefully, but nature itself places certain moral obligations or a certain moral structure upon us that I think it's useful for us to think about. Thirdly, I think it's useful particularly for pastors, never to make the assumption that people believe everything they say. You can never say some things too often. I learned as a pastor very often, that I could preach something and I thought I'd preached it very clearly. And, a proportion of my congregation would not understand it. So constantly preaching the whole counsel of God is a very good thing. And then lastly, and this I think is one that's perhaps hardest for certain Christians to accept, I think the church needs to stop thinking in terms of cultural war and thinking more in terms of cultural protest. What do I mean by that? Well, we live at a very interesting time in the United States. I grew up in a country where the church was pretty marginal anyway. So I'd never, until I moved to America, I'd never moved to a country where Christianity had any sort of major powerful civil influence. I've been in America now for 20 years. I barely recognize the country I live in now from the one I moved to 20 years ago seems totally different. I moved here 3 weeks before 9/11. What a watershed moment to emigrate and arrive in a foreign country. And what happens when people feel that they own something and it's being torn from their grasp rather violently and rather rapidly? There's a temptation to get angry, and there's a temptation to fight fire with fire. The recent Capitol riots and protests, sort of symptomatic of that, in a way that we can see, people on the left doing the same kind of thing. I think the church needs to resist the temptation to think about what she does here on earth as warfare. I prefer to think in terms of cultural protest. I'm not saying the church should go along with the culture. I'm saying the church should protest the culture. How does the church do that? The church protests the culture by being an alternative culture. The church protests the culture by being a community of people who love each other and care for each other, by showing hospitality to the outsider, by acting in a manner consistent with what she preaches. That may look slightly different in different parts of the country. It may look different in your town in the Carolinas to what it does in Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania. But the church protests the culture by being, if you like, a little taste of heaven on earth. One of the things that most impressed me and most fascinated me as I was working on the book, and with this I'll close, was the success of the LGBTQ movement. Now, I have very serious reservations about the LGBTQ movement. What impressed me about the LGBTQ was its success. And some of that's down to very effective lobbying, but a lot of it's down to the fact that it was a genuine community. It was a powerful, genuine community that gave people an identity. And it came from the margins to the center. I think as the church is being shunted to the margins in the United States, we should lament that. We can lament that. But we shouldn't allow it to turn us into sort of passive, nostalgic people. I think we should also see it as an opportunity, because the margins are places where strong communities can be fostered. And if the church is a strong community, there's really no force on earth that can resist it at that point. So I would close by saying one of the things that, and I've been developing this really since I finished the book. I think I've thought more about this since I finished writing it than when I wrote it. But the church as a community of protest against the wider culture is a model worth thinking about as we move into a kind of post-Christian future for America. Happy to take any questions. Whether I can answer them or not, I can't tell in advance, but I'm certainly happy to hear any questions and do my best to respond.
Dr. Trueman, they're going to submit their questions via chat.
Okay.
You can keep some order here, so you can be looking at the chat box. They might be for you privately or publicly, but as they're thinking, I know you're a church historian. Is there something that we can learn from church history that can be applied today to our current situation?
Yeah, I mean, one of the temptations for a lot of Christians, of course, is to, and a good temptation, when I say temptation, it always sounds bad. I actually mean one of the good things to do is always to think, other analogies with times past, other points in the past where the church has been in a similar situation, and how did the church manage? Well, part of the good news is that the church has actually been in a worse situation in the past, and it's still here. I'd rather be in America today than Stalin's Russia in 1930, or China today for that matter. So there's plenty of grounds for hope. We shouldn't despair. Don't be optimistic. Don't be a naive optimist. But history gives plenty of evidence that God's promise, surprise, surprise, that the church will survive and triumph, holds good. More specifically, are the particular contexts in which we might find more precise analogies. And Protestants often go to the Reformation because that's our kind of glory days. We wax lyrical about the Reformation. Catholics often go to the late Middle Ages, and they think the late Middle Ages was where the greatness of the church and the papacy lies. I think both of those are wrong-headed, because the church was incredibly powerful in both situations. I think the second century, the church is marginal. It's existing within a dominant pagan culture, and it's subject to accusations of being seditious. Jesus is Lord sounds as if you're taking a slap at Caesar. It's being accused of being seditious, not existing for the common good, we might say, and also being immoral. Hey, brothers and husbands and wives call each other brothers and sister. They get together and they eat body and drink blood. It sounds rather distasteful. So they were subject to the same kind of moral criticisms or moral register that we are today. How did they respond? They responded by being good citizens. The word piety in Latin originally meant good citizenship. So when Christians were claiming to be pious, they would say, we're good citizens. They did their best to try to persuade the authorities, leave us alone and we'll be good citizens, we'll be good employees. There are points we can't go. There are places we can't go. If you want us to sacrifice to Caesar as a god, we can't do that. But within the limits of what our religion allows, we will be the best citizens you have. The analogy is not perfect because Rome had never known Christianity. We're living in a world that's known Christianity and has rejected it. But I think that the second century and the strategy of the church in the second century of being this tight-knit, distinct community that yet connected with the outside world and was part of the outside world in an obedient way as it could. That's not a bad analogy.
Thank you. I think Jerry Sitzer says something very, very similar in Resilient Faith. But we've got some questions now in the chat box if you want to.
Okay. I'll work through them. I'm not prioritizing them. I'm just going to work through them as they pop up in my list. So do you have recommended resources for developing a biblical theology of the body, particularly for college students? Yes, there's a great new book out by a guy called Christopher West. If you want to email, my email's on the Grove City website. If you want to email me for the details, or Michael can email me and I can send them to you. Our Bodies Tell God's Story is the title of the book. He's a Catholic priest, but he writes the book. He actually says in the preface, I've written this book in a way that Protestants and Catholics can read it. He doesn't deal with distinctively Catholic stuff in it. It's a generic book for Christians. I'm going to be teaching a Sunday school class on sex and sexuality for my own church in the next couple of years. I'm an OPC minister and I'm going to be using this book. So I'd say it's a great book for all Christians to look at. Would recommend that. And written for the level of college students. College students will find it very, very accessible. Dr. Trueman, you indicated it's important for the church to have a strong theology of the body. Natural law is connected with that. Who are some contemporary Christian thinkers who are developing natural law cases for traditional sexual ethics you find helpful? Ryan Anderson, who's just this week moved to the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Look up Ryan Anderson's writings on the trans issue and on the gay issue. Andrew Walker, who's a friend of mine at Southern Baptist Seminary. Andrew has got a book coming out on religious freedom, which is rooted in natural law. So those are two guys I would say to watch for, and they will connect you to others because they have bibliographies that will connect you to other people worth reading. Robbie George, professor of jurisprudence at Princeton. He's the sort of the grand old man of this from a Christian perspective. Anything Robbie writes on this is well worth looking at. Put yourself on the daily mailing list for Public Discourse. Look Public Discourse up online. They do a daily mailing. Every day they send out an article. And I would say probably half of them touch on natural law issues. You'll find it an incredibly helpful resource. Dr. Trueman, developing a mindset of cultural protest in cultural war. I'm curious how you would say we approach biblical passages that use wartime language. Certainly it's not necessarily a war of violent response, but a spiritual war happening around us. Do you think we should just be careful to identify the kind of war we're in? Very good question. I would say clearly the Bible it presents Christian history as warfare between good and evil. What I'm thinking about here is the idioms we use. And I think often when we think of war, we use very worldly idioms for warfare. I would go to Corinthians and I would say, look at what Paul says about the cross. The cross for Paul turns everything upside down. How does God wage warfare on the cross? Through weakness. And I think that's something the church has lost. That we tend to fight the cultural war with worldly weapons. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't vote your conscience. It's not to say that as citizens, we shouldn't use our civil rights to try to get good legislation on the books, and we shouldn't rejoice when good legislation gets on the books. But it is to say we need to be careful that our understanding of the war between good and evil doesn't lead us to adopt tactics that are really worldly in terms of their power play. So very good question, very good question. I would simply say what I'm saying is I'm really talking about the sort of the style and idiom, and protest is like war in many ways, but perhaps thinking of it in that way makes us less inclined to go down the worldly weapon route. How do you think the church should then approach the LGBT community so they will understand both the Gospels and what Christians are like? Because very many Christians may have given the wrong idea of what Christianity is. Absolutely. And this is a tricky question. And I would say to students, make a distinction. I make a distinction between the LGBTQ movement as a political, cultural lobby group and individuals who are gay. I would say this issue can only be solved on a personal relationship level. I really don't think that dealing with people as blocks is useful in terms of communicating the gospel. I'm very influenced by my friend Rosaria Butterfield. She was professor of queer theory at Syracuse University. She's a lesbian. She's now married to a Reformed Presbyterian pastor. They're even more cranky than the OPC. So she's gone from so far on the left to so far on the right. She was converted because she was befriended by a Reformed pastor and his wife. And they didn't see her as an object of evangelism. When other pastors were getting together to protest her giving a lecture, they invited her for dinner. They struck up a friendship. They reached out and were kind to her. And so I think friendships is the way to communicate this. You've got to show people the gospel as well as tell them this. Not that one should ever undermine the telling of the gospel, but the telling of the gospel is helped by lives that demonstrate its power. And take a tricky situation, for example. You've got a friend and you've got a gay friend and he's getting married and he invites you to the wedding. Should you go? My answer would be no, you should not go, because at some point in that service, probably the minister's going to say, does anybody know any reason why these two people should not be joined together in marriage? And if you're a conservative Christian, yeah, you know why they shouldn't be joined together in marriage. And you saying no is going to offend your friend. It's going to upset it because it's going to be seen as a kind of denial. But I would say, okay, but say to them, look, when you get back from your holiday, your honeymoon, whatever, come around for dinner. You can still, if you like, make a step towards showing friendship to that person. And they might still turn around to you and say, no, you've blown it. You're not coming to my wedding. I'm kicking the dust off my feet. But in that situation, I think you could sleep at night and think, well, I took the stand I had to take, but I still tried to be a practical, loving friend to this person. So I think we need to, on the LGBTQ thing, not think so much in how do we deal with this at the macro level. We need to think about how we engage people at the local level. And I would say that goes beyond the LGBTQ thing. Christianity now has such a bad press from the media, and everybody in positions of cultural authority is presenting Christianity as, wicked, seditious, etc., etc. It's not just an LGBTQ problem we've got, it's a problem with society in general. The only way to overcome that, I think, is by practically demonstrating that many of the things said about us are simply not true. Who's the primary audience for your book? What have college students' responses been to it? Primary audience, I guess, was Christians, but I wrote it in a way that non-Christians pick up. A good friend of mine I found the other week as a rabbi was quoting it in one of his homilies. And I'm sort of, wow, I don't think I've ever been quoted by a rabbi before, but clearly it's not so offensively Christian that a rabbi was put off by it. So the primary audience is Christians, I think, but I wrote it in a way that a non-Christian hopefully could pick it up and read it and say, yeah, I agree. And I've had a lot of response from people, and I don't know what their faith commitment is that's been very positive. Students I've engaged on it have all been pretty positive so far. Now, admittedly, Grove City students are at the generally, not exclusively, at the conservative end of the spectrum on the kind of issues I'm dealing with. So it wasn't entirely a surprise to me, but response has been pretty positive. In counseling, do you start with identity? Are there any words you avoid because they are so identity charged? Tough question, because in my experience as a pastor, every counseling situation is unique, and you have to make strategic decisions relative to the person that you're speaking to, relative to the background and the broader context. So the obvious, the really sensitive one would be here. What about pronouns? If I'm counseling somebody who says they're a woman, but they were born a biological male, do I make the concession of using female pronouns about them when I'm talking to them? I'm still thinking that one through. I would say generally no, but I'm not prepared to say there's no situation in which I wouldn't make that concession in order to generate a conversation that might carry things in a helpful direction. So I think in that situation, be very thoughtful, be very sensitive, and take into account the specifics of the context in which you find yourself. Love to hear anything you have to offer on the subject of tolerance. Oftentimes, anything not LGBT is seen as hateful or homophobic. How might you approach the tolerance issue while still communicating a loving perspective? The problem with tolerance in our culture is this, that tolerance is not enough. To tolerate someone's identity is still to deny it to some extent. Okay, I don't mind my gay neighbors, they can do whatever they want to do behind closed doors. I'll tolerate that. They shouldn't be sent to prison for that. But that still means their identity is hidden behind closed doors as far as they're concerned. So I actually think the debate today is not about tolerance. Sometimes people use that language, but the issue is really equality. What the LGBTQ movement wants, and by and large what they've achieved, is not tolerance, but equality. And as you say, anything that criticizes that is seen as hateful or homophobic. It's very, very difficult to respond to that other than really by thinking in terms of my last question. That is, well, these slurs can be thrown at us. We need to make sure that they are just slurs, that nothing we say or do is truly hateful, that we're actually acting out of Christian love and not speaking beyond the bounds that the Bible authorizes us to speak. One of the first reviews of my book was, it's a homophobic book, and he compares homosexuals to people who commit incest. I never do that anywhere in the book. One of the things again, as I was writing the book, I thought was, I know these criticisms are going to come because people know who I am, but I don't want them to be able to quote a single line in my book that would give them justification for saying that. They're going to say it regardless. They're going to say it about us regardless. Let's not give them any evidence to back up their claims. Connection between popular escapist eschatology and post-Christian culture we are in today. How should our eschatology impact the way we engage modern culture? I think there can be a tendency to start sort of either weave eschatology into an elaborate conspiracy theory, or to start thinking, well, Christianity is all about what happens when we die and nothing about the here and now. I think Christians always need to strike a balance. We are to be heavenly minded. We are a pilgrim people. This is not our home. We should have limited expectations about what we can achieve here. We definitely should. On the other hand, we should not limit our expectations so much that we do not fulfill our responsibilities to the widow, to the sojourner, to the weak, to the unborn, etc., to our fellow men and women that we meet in the street. So I do think that some escapist eschatologies could well be connected to the general cultural collapse, or the collapse of cultural Christianity we see around us. But we should do better. And I think a balance that neither shoves everything off into the afterlife, nor so roots everything in this life, is an important one to strike. Key scripture passages that you think is essential to begin to teach the theology of the body, whether at church or in college: Genesis 1 and 2. And then I think Paul's teaching in Corinthians, very significant in a number of levels, when he talks about, a man who's sleeping with a prostitute has committed a particularly heinous sin because of what's been done with his body. Reflect upon the significance of that. I think. So rattling through these at a great speed. So I'm not sure I'm going to get to them all, but I'm happy to take some by email. You'll have to sort of wait as I got a backlog, but I'll work them. I've noticed the media and entertainment industry have been making fun of Christianity, but not other religions. Why do you think they're doing that? There have been movies and shows that make fun of Jesus and the nuclear family. How should we respond? I think because Christianity has been the dominant cultural force, then picking on Christianity, people can still see that that's picking on the man, that's speaking truth to power. I think increasingly that is a very tenuous view. And other religions such as Judaism, well, if you pick on Judaism, you're anti-Semitic. If you pick on Islam, you're Islamophobic because they're minority religions. So I do think Christianity, it's a sort of compliment, if you like, that we're regarded as so powerful that we're easy to pick on. How should we respond? Kind word turns away wrath. Answer a fool according to his folly. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Make strategic decisions about how to respond. I found I spent the first half of my academic life fighting polemics with polemics. About 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I discovered that actually responding in a calm way to critics can be very disarming and wrong foot them. So, a kind word can actually be the most polemically powerful thing you fire in a particular situation. So think carefully about that. Should probably, Michael, make this the last one, if that's okay, because I'll need to move on. At a time in America where the culture thinks gender identity is malleable and sexual orientation is fixed, what are the thoughts of the role of science in persuasion, as many of these claims are falsifiable? Western societies embrace science, but then turn around and abandon it on these issues. I think you're pointing there to the fact that, yes, Western societies embraced science when it suits what Western society wants to achieve, by and large. Don't want to sound too postmodern, but Western society is very eclectic in how it connects to science. It's very interesting that, President Biden came in on the mandate of leading with science, and he was thinking about COVID. And one of the first things he does is sign into law a trans bill. I'm the faculty sponsor of the Women's Rugby Club at Grove City College. I tell you that there is a big difference between those who are biologically male and those who are biologically female on the rugby pitch, such that it would be suicide for my women to go onto the pitch against a man's team. When trans ideology is built on the fact that any physical evidence you can provide that men and women are different is by definition not evidence of that and can be put to one side, it's impossible to make a scientific argument against what is a very, very unscientific thesis. The good news is that nature wins in the end. Ultimately, we will be mugged by reality. The bad news is that muggings are very, very painful, and an awful lot of human lives are going to be destroyed in the interim. But on the LGBTQ issue, I'm actually uncharacteristically optimistic that in 100 years from now, transgenderism will be on the dust pile of history. And we will remember it as we think about other terrible medical treatments of the past, that we had people who desperately needed help, and what we gave them was precisely what they did not need at the time. Better call it a day there, Michael. As I say, I'm happy to take more questions over coming weeks on email if people care to shoot them to me. But it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. I hope I did what I was asked. I'm never quite sure when I'm speaking cold to a new audience.
It was excellent. Thank you so much. And we appreciate your comments. We appreciate your willingness to stay and answer questions. He was only scheduled to speak for about 45 minutes, but he graciously offered to take a few questions afterwards. So we're very thankful, and we wish you the very best.
Thanks very much. And if any of you are ever passing through Grove City, which you probably won't be, it's in the middle of nowhere, but let me know. I'd love to meet you in person.
Thank you.
Stay in touch, Michael.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Michael.